All right, guys. Today on the Lions Guy podcast, we've got Mr. Dan Jarvis, who's an Army veteran, and also how I met him. He's founder of a really impactful organization, 220 nonprofit. And we're going to get into all. I'm not even going to try to explain what you guys are doing. That's why I got you here. I want you to really break it down for us because there's so much value in what you guys are doing. So look forward to talking to you about that. And Dan, welcome to the Lions Guy podcast. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Hey, Dale, appreciate it for the opportunity to share our story and journey with your audience. Dan Jarvis, I'm a combat veteran, United States Army. I deployed to Iraq for 15 months, Afghanistan for 12 months. I also served as a law enforcement officer in Central Florida for about 7 years. I started the nonprofit. It was actually about 4 years ago. Actually, it was 4 years ago, April of 2018.
Mm.
And it wasn't, I mean, it was kind of funny it wasn't funny how it started, but I was married at the time, and I had just left the sheriff's office. And, when they say the idle mind is the devil's playground, it truly is. I kind of spiraled, all of the emotions started flooding back, the nightmares, the intensity of the nightmares, the night sweats. I was like, what is going on? I thought I was past this. So I actually went down the VA rabbit hole, looking for answers. I didn't have a badge or a security clearance to worry about. So I'm like, hey, I'm needing some help here, right? And then, of course, the VA, their first protocol is here, fill this prescription, go take these antidepressants, and then we'll start scheduling therapy. And then I went down the therapy rabbit hole with a VA, and it was the second session. They called to cancel my third, and when I tried to reschedule, I couldn't get in for 4 weeks, and then I went back, and then they canceled another follow up appointment, and I
Was
couldn't
this
get
your
in for eight
first
weeks.
exposure to therapy or anything like that?
Very, very, very first time that I ever went to therapy was through the VA.
Mm.
I'll be honest with you, I'm glad I did it. Exposure therapy is what they do. It's called prolonged exposure, and then they do what's called in vivo exposure. So they give you homework assignments.
Mm.
But what I found is you start activating those emotions. You start opening boxes that I had no desire to open because, obviously 27 months deployed in combat and 7 years in law enforcement, and not to mention probably the worst stuff was in childhood. I was like, this is going to take forever to get
Mm.
through. So that was really my VA experience. And I was like, okay, there's got to be a better way.
So,
And then I just
Dan,
started. Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you, but so that said, let's rewind it. So how'd you land? How'd you get there? Because we jumped into you were having these physical reactions to what we're going to talk about today, which is trauma. But how did you get there? What was the story behind kind of getting you to that point where you're having this struggle?
Yeah. Appreciate you bringing me back to that. So it was really my second deployment to Afghanistan that was probably the most significant. Even though the first deployment, we lost more guys, I was directly impacted on my second deployment. Um, Four of my men were medevaced out of country, not to return to the fight. One of our soldiers was killed, and I felt extremely responsible for. I stepped on a pressure plate. I detonated an IED on a dismounted patrol that was literally like 5 feet away. By the grace of God, I'm even here.
Mm.
That was just probably what really started a lot of things because that's when the sleep stopped. Imagine being in combat, doing combat operations, and you're a squad leader, right? Your job, I've got a 9-man group, and I have attachments, radio operators and machine gun teams that you're responsible for, and then you're not sleeping.
Mm.
So what happened is after that first IED blast, that was late July, I think it was July 28th of 2011. I literally every time I would close my eyes, I would hear an explosion in my mind, and I'd be up.
So
I
were
remember the
you
first three.
uninjured? You were uninjured from the IED
Well,
plate?
I had TBI. They took me off the battle roster for about a week, and
Okay.
I fought tooth and nail to get back onto it.
Mm.
Because you want to lead your men. Even right afterwards, when Major Greenberg says, "Hey, you're not going out for a while," dude, I was with my PL. I'm like, "Hey, LT, you need to go tell the major that hey, I need to get back on the battle roster. I got to get back to work. I got men to lead. That whole the whole bravado of the infantry."
Mm.
And he went and talked to the doc and came back and says, "Sorry, Jarvis, but." He said, if you experience another blast that's significant within a very short period of time, it can kill you. I'm like, okay. At that point, I was like, all right, I'll take my week off, and took the week off. And then I got back on the battle roster, but I'm not sleeping. All right. First few times I would literally nod off to go to sleep. I'd hear that explosion and my heart's racing like 180 beats a minute. I'm thinking incoming is coming into the fob, and I'm putting my gear on and nobody else is. And that's when I realized, okay, something's going on.
Mm.
And so then I had the physical, sleep deprivation is, man, that just jacks everything up. So
If I've
yeah,
learned
so I'm like
anything,
literally
man,
a
I am
zombie.
nothing without my sleep, brother. Yeah,
I
that's
know.
the one. I don't compromise on that anymore. I've just learned it just not the same person, without sleep.
Well, sleep is so important because that's how we hit our REM sleep, and then we can actually at that point start processing our emotions. And but so I'm not hitting REM sleep. So we're talking, and then 3 weeks later, I'm in the lead convoy, lead truck commander in a striker convoy, and my job on the lead is to find the IED so we can bring the EOD guys, the explosives guys up and exploit it. And when the IED detonated in the fourth vehicle behind me, that's when I realized I missed it, right? And that's when we lost Doug Cordo. I remember, August 19th, 9:36 in the morning in the Zabul province of Afghanistan, like it was yesterday.
Mm.
And from that moment forward, man, I hated myself. And the reason I hated myself was because here I am leading men in combat, and I should have had the courage to say, hey, I'm not doing really hot right now. I might
Mm.
need somebody else up front. So those are the things that would go through my mind. I'm like, would Doug still be here if I had another NCO up front? Would they have found it? And ultimately, I put the blame on myself, and I realized later that I didn't place the IED. I didn't do anything unethical or immoral. I did what I was trained to do, and it was deep buried. We probably would have never found it anyway, and it was command wired, so it wasn't like the mine roller couldn't have detonated it. It was command wired, and that vehicle was targeted. Because it was an MGS main gun system striker, which has a 105 howitzer on it, so it looks like a tank with
Mm.
wheels, because they hit that vehicle a second time as we were dragging it out. So yeah, that was just a wild day, and I remember just seeing the look on the guys' faces when we got back to the forward operating base, and everyone was just, it was devastating.
Yeah.
Doug Cordo, this kid he was like the humor of the platoon, right? He was the one who would do the stupidest stuff but make you laugh, right?
Yeah.
So that was tough. So I still progressed forward from that, and I still lost guys even after that. And then at the end of the deployment is when everything just unraveled. I got a Red Cross notice, and that's when I got word that my mom had a massive heart attack, and she probably wasn't going to make it. So I'm helpless. I'm like, I got guys, do I stay? And then of course I'm grateful my first sergeant was like, hey, Sergeant Jarvis, we got 3 weeks left in country. We don't need you. You're going home. So he made
Mm.
the decision for me. I didn't make it in time to say goodbye. And I remember after doing the funeral services, and I'm back in Alaska waiting for my guys to come home. Uh, First thing I did is I went to a Class 6 store, which is a liquor store on base, and I got a case of beer, and I drank until I passed out. And then I realized, oh, I can sleep, right? And that just kind of became a routine. I would drink, sleep, repeat, right? Go to
Mm.
work, drink, sleep, repeat. Not realizing how detrimental that was from a mental health perspective. I know now, it was not allowing me to process those emotions. It was not allowing me to hit my REM sleep cycles. And then the depressing part of the alcohol, it was just making things just worse. And it was literally a year after we returned. I'm literally sitting there looking at a rifle in the corner of my room, and I'm like, you know what? I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. I said, just take 1 second, pull the trigger. But fortunately, the kids that lived in the apartment above me just kind of ran across the floor. And I'm like, whoa, that's the stupidest idea ever. And then I realized, high powered round would go right through the ceiling. And I had no desire to hurt somebody else. My beef was with myself. So I went to sleep that night, just like normal. And then it was March 2nd, 2013. My phone rings about 8:30 in the morning. It was Ryan, who was my driver in Afghanistan, and goes, "Hey, Sergeant Jarvis, did you hear about Corey?" And I'm like, when those questions are asked, somebody's either dead or in jail. And I'm
Sure.
like, nobody, what's going on? So Corey shot and killed himself last night. So I was like, holy crap. And I just remember at that moment, I looked at that rifle and I was like, man, if we'd have lost two in one night, what that would have done to the morale of a unit. So that week, preparing for Corey's memorial service, helped me to realize this can't be my exit plan. I didn't want to greenlight my guys to do the same thing, and plus I saw how it impacted them on a personal level, how it devastated them. So I always credit Corey for saving my life. Unfortunately, it's when he took his own. So that's one of the reasons why I think we work so hard as a nonprofit, because for me, this is extremely personal.
Mm.
You know, and I was eventually medically retired from the Army September 11th of 2014. The Army says, "Hey, we need a healthy body," because at that point I'd already had 3 surgeries on two shoulders and both shoulders and my knee, and I got it. It was in that 2014 drawdown, and I realized my last surgery was a high risk because I'm literally in that mid level. I was a staff sergeant, promotable at the time, and then once I had the surgery, then it was like they dropped the medical evaluation board paperwork. And doctor says you're no longer fit to be a non-commissioned officer as in the infantry. So
Mm.
I get it. So that started my transition journey. And I
Were
went
you
from
were
one.
you understanding of that or a bit resentful of it? Like, how was
Well,
that affecting you? Because that's the thing, right? Like, we see a lot of veterans that they love the Army, they love the Marine Corps, they want to be there for life, they want to be the 26-year guy, and then they get processed out for whatever reason. It's been my experience. It wasn't my experience, but in talking to others who experienced it, it's a bit rip the Band-Aid off too in some cases where I, but what was
yeah.
your experience and how
Well,
did
the initial reaction was a very raw kind of like, man, this is my life, right?
yeah.
What am I going to do now? I'm at this point damaged goods, right?
Mm.
I wanted to retire out as a sergeant major. That was the goal. I would have eventually got to that path, and now it's gone. But at the same time, the intellect of me realizes that, hey, this is for the preservation of liberty and life as we know it. If I can't do the job, somebody else needs to. So I
Sure.
did understand, because I wasn't young. I was what, 42 at that point.
Mm.
So 42 years old, which is literally I was at that range of most of the sergeant majors,
Mm.
because I had such a break in service from when I first enlisted. Um, you know, so I'm already on the high level of that spectrum. I mean, it probably would have been 50 by the time I hit sergeant major, but I still would have done it if I could have. And yeah, I understood. So I did understand the need to have a healthy NCO leading men. So
Yeah.
it was. I mean, it was a big pill to swallow. It was one I took it with stride.
Sure.
I was fortunate. One of my wounded warriors in Afghanistan, his father was the elected sheriff of Seminole County, Florida, and I got to meet him after we brought all the wounded warriors and the Gold Star families up in our post deployment ball. I was kind of his chaperone. He actually talked me to go back into law enforcement, and I didn't even really think about that. And I did. I put one uniform on, I took one off, and then I put another one back on.
Mm.
But something really weird happened when I got sworn in as a deputy sheriff. I'm working in a crime suppression team, so I got an unmarked vehicle, I got tactical clothing, and we do like street level interdiction of like narcotics and problem solving. If we got burglaries in a specific area, we're hitting that area really hard to try to remedy the problem. And I felt normal again. It
Mm.
was the weirdest thing I was like, oh, good, I'm awesome, right? Kind of like the combat vet that wants to go back to war because they don't feel like a fish out of water.
Right.
So I was actually in an environment where my brain was operating the way it's supposed to, right?
Mm.
Law enforcement officers, firefighters, paramedics, they're always operating fight or flight, right? Because every call they go on, not every call, but most calls they go on, you know, have the potential of rising to that life or death. So you're operating the way your brain is supposed to. So I felt normal again for that 2-year period. Of
Now
course,
you
you got to
say now
realize.
you say your brain is operating the way it's supposed to, but to them, to their perspective, yeah.
Well,
Because I don't like because that's not I was going to use the word normal. That's not typical of everyone's looking to operate in fight or flight. So I wanted to kind of like get your perspective on kind of like that desire to operate at fight or flight, so to speak.
so for PTS, right? If you got post traumatic stress, your brain is hardwired fight or flight.
Mm.
Think of it in terms of, and this will probably make sense if you're a car guy, right? The brain idles at 1,000 RPMs. Okay, a traumatic event occurs or a critical incident occurs. You hit the gas pedal. RPMs go 7,000, 8,000, and then the foot never comes off the gas pedal.
Mm.
Your brain is always pushing into that fight or flight. So when you put that uniform on and you're carrying a gun and you're wearing a ballistic vest and you're interacting with people who don't like you, the similarities between combat and law enforcement were eerie. All right. That
Oh
was
yeah.
one of the first things I noticed when I was in Iraq. I was like, oh, this feels a lot like being a police officer, right?
Mm,
Same mindset, right? Because you're a cop. You go to a restaurant. Guess where your back is? It's to a wall. What are you doing? You're looking at the doorways and the exits. What are you doing? You're scanning everybody's hands. Same things you're doing when you're deployed. So that's what I'm talking about. That fight or flight response. So when I went back into law enforcement, I felt normal,
mm,
right? I didn't feel like there was something wrong with me because I'm operating the way the brain is supposed to in that fight or flight environment. That's another reasons why first responders. I'll give you an example. Police officers in a 30-year career will, on average, be exposed to 188 traumatic incidents. All
mm.
right, think about that. We outsource trauma to the first responders. And that's over a long career, and then you're also guaranteed to live about 20 years less than your average counterpart.
Sure.
When you think about it from that context, um, that's huge.
Yeah.
That's the stress that our law enforcement officers are operating under. Firefighters, it's the same thing. Paramedics, you're always going to those emergency calls, those traffic crashes. You're doing CPR on a 2-year-old. It wreaks havoc on the body from a physical perspective.
Right.
That's that whole trauma. So when you have that RPMs pegged, your body is literally producing stress hormones and adrenaline, and you go into adrenal fatigue. Your cortisol levels are off the charts, and then all of a sudden, heart disease, right? Diabetes,
Mm.
pick your cancer, strokes, things that are very prevalent with folks that are in those high stress environments over long periods of time. It's a
No,
very unhealthy profession.
I would say
But
kind of like playing with your analogy just to kind of bring that around, right? It's almost like, you've got that engine pegged, right? And that's not good for the engine, right? Long term. Sure, for a short term, it could probably sit there and be pegged at 7,000 RPMs, but it's not sustainable. And similarly, I think to kind of fit it kind of in perspective, when you're affected by PTS and you're running at 7,000 RPMs 24/7, it's just not sustainable, and you're overloading your system. You're burning it out from its natural, right? We've got our natural ways to heal ourselves and whatever, but it's
yep.
it's yeah.
Well, when you have those, PTS symptoms, and we run into this a lot with law enforcement officers or firefighters. You come off of a long day at work, you're amped, your RPMs are going. So how do we calm those RPMs? What do we typically do? A few cocktails, 4 or 5 beers, depress the system a little bit, and that's how we sleep.
Mm,
And that does extreme unhealthy issues.
yep.
The body can't keep it. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk wrote the book The Body Keeps Score, and he talks about how trauma will store at that cellular level of the body, and then it'll manifest itself with physical symptoms, with fibromyalgia, all the diseases that are associated with stress. In Florida, law enforcement officers are considered high risk, so they get a little bit more on their pension, not because the job is more dangerous, but because they don't live as long. All right. Let
Mm,
that sink in. The average, police officer will live 20 years less. Now you do get people who they manage stress fine. They're very healthy. Maybe they had a great support system as a child, but how many of us had those perfect lives?
mm.
It ends up impacting and affecting us at very serious levels, because
Well, first off, yeah, hats off to, like you mentioned, the body keep score in the training I went through, and I picked it up. I just finished it this morning. Been reading the last couple of weeks, and a couple things there, like similar analogy. He made the comment or the analogy, like the with that fight flight fear after PTS. He kind of used that smoke detector. He's like, the smoke detector's broke. It's always
Mhm.
alerting even when there's no smoke, right? It's broken. And I thought that was kind of another good analogy. But he made a good point kind of in the later chapters of you would think that if you had a tough childhood, you would be more resilient to the world, like the challenges of the world, the hardships of the world. But to your point, he was saying that, in fact, those who come from a more loving environment and supportive environment have the more resiliency to deal with it. It's not the other way around. I thought that was a really interesting point.
Yeah, a lot of it is based on your perception of what trauma is
Yeah.
and by your experiences, and then you look at the neurological connections, the pathways neurologically will connect event to event to event. Think of it as
Mm,
you ever get your fishing line all tangled up and then you can't untangle it.
mm,
Right. All of those traumas will actually connect to each other. So it's a compounding effect. So those that do have those tougher childhoods, their filters are changed. They're
Yeah.
different. They see things different. They see the world different. Whereas, somebody who grew up in that loving, nurturing, two-parent home and, had no bad, adverse impact in childhood, their brains are more resilient to the actual being
Mm,
able to bounce back. Those of
yeah.
us, and to think about it from this perspective, how many people chase the professions that are high stress that have had bad childhoods? You
Yeah.
know, we want to help other people, we want to help ourselves, and then all of a sudden you're compounding your trauma, and the next thing you know, something maybe personal happens. It could be a divorce, and all of a sudden everything just unravels.
Mm.
And hugely impactful ways, and sometimes it's deadly.
Yeah, and I guess give us a little bit on that because you mentioned some childhood experience. Like, do you feel that led to your desire to serve? Kind of like, kind
There's 100% connection. When those experiences occurred, I wanted to help other people, prevent other people. It's one of the reasons why I went law enforcement, military. One, you want to protect yourself. I'm going to make sure this never happens again. Right?
mm,
How do I do that? Join the military, become a police officer, firefighter, and I'm helping other people and safeguarding other people. So yeah, it definitely was. It directed my future for sure. There's
yeah,
no question about it. I went into the military to do something, be productive, help people, and then I went into law enforcement for the same thing.
yeah. Yeah, and I think kind of what you're saying, it is that it's like it's different stages. You were mentioning coming from the military, the PTS, result of it, that high RPM, and needing to get in alignment with that. And if you kind of shift that back in someone's timeline, say, hey, similarly, traumatic childhood, redlined, and they're living with that red line. And what I've learned of you guys, it's unknowingly, right? Like I think, I was looking forward to about this conversation is bringing an awareness to what trauma is so that we can shine a light on it, right? Because I think that's what I've taken away most over the last couple of months of what I've gotten from you guys is that I didn't even know what it was really, and not me. And I've even worked with folks on behalf of 220 FAR that didn't even, that think like it's only combat, right? Trauma's only
Right.
combat.
Yeah, we run into a lot of civilians. They'll say those things like, "Well, I didn't go to war. My trauma is nothing near what yours is." All right, but let's look at it from a real perspective. Trauma is extremely subjective. All right, the emotions connected are fear, terror, and helplessness. All right,
Mm,
you have no ability to do anything. You're a police officer. You're doing CPR on a 2-year-old. You have a 2-year-old at home, and you're helpless to help that kid, and he dies. All right.
mm,
Um, Somebody takes a shot at you, maybe shoots at you, or you step on a pressure plate, detonate IED, extreme terror, fear. Those are things that's the those are the building blocks of what trauma is. So if I'm in combat and I experience my event, and we rate the intensity of it's a 0 to 10 scale. It's just like pain, right? If my event rises to an 8, all right, and you're in a car crash where 3 people died, and your event rises to a 10, you're feeling the 10, I'm feeling the 8. Which one's worse? Subjectively, the car crash. So I always tell civilians, military and first responders, we do not hold a patent on trauma.
yeah.
I think in the United States, it's between 9 and 11 million people are clinically diagnosed with PTSD. Probably 2 to 3 times of the people have that. They just never go get help and never get evaluated or assessed for it. A prime example is we trained a police department, law enforcement agency in Central Florida. 13 of the deputies that we trained, 10 qualified for scores for PTSD, and they're
Mm,
working every single day. That should be a wake up call to a lot of people. The amount of stress and the pressure that law enforcement officers are working under. Firefighters, the same thing. You know, it's profound when you think of what we do or we ask people to do as a society, and then parts of society turn on them, right?
yeah.
And here they are, they're trying to do the right thing and help people, and then now there's part of society is like turning against them,
Yeah.
which adds to the feeling. It's like, what am I doing? Why am I risking my life for an ungrateful community? I mean, I couldn't imagine being a police officer in Portland, Oregon, or Seattle, Washington. Some of those areas where there's a large movement against them. Yeah, it's crazy. But so I would imagine that trauma is more prevalent in the first responder communities, than anybody could even imagine. Like if you
Yeah.
actually did the assessments. And the cool thing is, we're actually getting ready to purchase some equipment through the nonprofit, and we're going to embark on a study. Dr. Bequee, we're going to do the QEEG, the qualitative electroencephalograph, where we actually track the brain mapping. So we map the brain. You can actually see PTS in the brain without them even doing the subjective assessments.
Mm.
And that's the really cool thing. We actually worked with a police officer up in Maryland not too long ago, and Dr. Dave Hagdorn came up. He works with MARSOC guys out of Camp Lejeune, and he did the QEEG before I did any work with her, and she also did her subjective scores. And what was interesting is Dr. Hagdorn was like, looking at your brain imaging, your mapping, your brain's the worst I've ever seen. And he goes, I work with MARSOC guys, all right, Marine Special Operations. And then he said, now looking at your subjective scores, her scores were pegged. She was at the max for PTSD. She was at the max for anxiety. She was at the max for depression. He goes, your brain images match your subjective scores.
Mm.
And you should have seen the weight lifted. This girl was like, oh, I've been trying to tell them that, right? The
Mm.
unseen injuries. We can't see what's going on in the brain. But now we're actually getting to a point where we're going to be able to see that.
Yeah.
And from a health perspective, how cool would that be to, for an agency to have a clean brain scan before a person ever becomes hired, and then if there's issues, you resolve it, you fix it before you put them into the profession.
Mm.
So that's kind of one of the areas that we're looking to move towards, because the language is wrong. PTSD, the disorder part, is wrong. All right, it's profitable. Let's put it that way.
Mm.
What we're really looking at moving the conversation to is human potential.
Yeah.
What does the potential of that individual look like with that stuff off the brain, out of the brain, no longer affecting and impacting? And one of the issues that we also have is a lot of people have a hard time believing what we say, but like Dr. Hagdorn said, the session, I did 2 sessions with her, and then we did a follow-up brain scan, and the amygdala and the hippocampal region of the brain went back to normal within 24 hours. And his words were, that was profound. That's sometimes that's like, long-term therapy to get people to that, using EMDR, which is the method that he uses. And he was like, this proves it's not placebo. Because that's one of the things that, what if this is just placebo? We're actually going to be able to show and prove that it's not. There is something physically happening in the brain. So what that's doing is, if that brain can heal that quickly, is it a disorder or is it injury? That's the way we look at it. We look at it as an injury. You break an arm, you put a cast on it. All right. You have that accelerator peg and the RPMs are up. We just help you take the foot off the gas pedal and get you back into a normal pattern. And when that sleep restoration happens, that's the magic of it. When you hit REM sleep, that's when the brain's processing out and moving memories and doing the reconsolidation part. Insomnia, which is the sleep deprivation, self-medication, and prescribed medication, right? A lot of people don't realize many of the medications that they put us on are designed as REM sleep blockers.
Mm.
Well, that's like the cat is guarding the hen house at that point. That's why you keep in cycles.
Why? Why would they be REM? That's like unintended consequence of those meds are REM blockers, or is that?
If you do go do a little bit of homework on the NIH, the National Institute of Health website, and look for REM sleep blockers, you'll see many of the REM sleep blockers are your anti-anxieties and your SSRIs, the drugs that are prescribed for PTSD and anxiety and other issues. Well, if it's blocking your REM sleep, you're going to be in that cycle of therapy, drugs, therapy, drugs, therapy, drugs.
So it's in essence shutting off your natural ability to
Correct.
process these emotions at a time you need it most, so to speak. And is that because like whatever it's designed to do, like to numb the emotions?
That's the intention. The intention is to numb the emotions and basically make you not care, right?
Sure.
But that's why we lose people. It's like, is this all the world has to offer? Is numb feeling? I firmly believe if the VA would stop prescribing medications like that, they would probably stop half the suicides. I think people get to the point where they just don't care anymore.
Yeah.
If you don't feel emotions.
Yeah. And so, and even, in the book, The Body Keeps the Score, he pointed out like the VA, the exposure therapy. Just the exposure therapy, the positive outcomes are like 15%. Like it's it's not very high. It's not very effective, let's say. But it's the go-to. It's the 12 weeks reliving it, pouring it out, sucking through it over and over again. With you, so you were there, jumping back to your timeline, you were there, you were trying to go through the VA process. What happened from there?
So the last when they canceled my last appointment, they couldn't get me in for 8 weeks. I told them, I said, "Well, let me check my schedule, and come back and I'll reschedule." That was 2017.
Yeah.
You want any guesses on how many times the psychologist called to see where Dan Jarvis was?
Sure.
Never did. Right. So that's when I started. That's when I went on the search to try to find a better way. I was like, "There's got to be something out there." This is, by that time it's 2017. I was like, "There's got to be something out there that's better than what they have to offer." And I went through the EMDR. I went through accelerated resolution therapy, and then I went through a process called the reconsolidation of traumatic memories (RTM) protocol.
Hmm.
And that was invited to go out. I had already started the nonprofit in April of 2018. And this was I think it was September of 2018. They did the very first public training. So I'm in New Mexico at the Mind Research Network at the University of New Mexico. And there's about 25 mental health counselors, and they're conducting the very first public training. And I'm coming out of a law enforcement profession, right? So I'm extremely skeptical. I'm like, these guys are making some pretty ballsy claims, right? Cop brain is like, yeah, I'm going to call bull crap, And the second day, we were on a break, and I was talking to the trainer. His guy name was Alan. And I'm like, you guys are making some pretty lofty claims on PTS. I said, if I'm going to refer or recommend anybody to go through this, I want to experience it myself. Basically, I was calling bullshit. And he said, yeah, you want to do it in front of the class when we come off break in 15 minutes? I'm like, bro, I carried a gun for a living. I'm not scared of people. Let's do this. All right. And my intentions was like more of an act of defiance on what they were saying. I'm like, I'm going to show these guys that they're full of crap. Right. That's just the skeptical nature of the human brain. I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever. Because they claim 90% success. All right. So I'm like, I'm sitting in front of the class. Now that process, it's kind of like cognitive behavioral therapy on the front end, the exposure, they have you talk about it. And then when you trigger, they stop you, they reground you, and then they run the visual kinesthetic disassociation part, which is the part we use. They run that visual kinesthetic part, and then you follow up with talk therapy on the backside. And I remember I was telling the story when we had lost Doug, when the IED blast went off, and I triggered pretty hardcore, and I didn't expect that in front of people. I was like, I don't even know these people, and I'm getting emotional up here, and next thing I know, he's asking me what color my Dodge truck is, and I'm like, "What?" I'm a Ford guy, right? So I was like, "What? I would never drive a Dodge." I have actually, but I would never do that, And then I realized he totally got me out of it. He broke the state of the emotion, and then we got regulated a little bit, talked a little bit, and then we set up the process. And then, after the rewind part of that, I was like, he asked me to tell the story again. And I started telling the story again. And I was telling the story, and I was waiting for it. I'm like, where's the emotions? It's going to come at any moment. It's not coming. And then I got through the whole story, and I literally looked at him. I'm like, dude, I said, what kind of Jedi stuff is this? Right? Half the class is laughing at that, and the other half is crying because I just watched a real world traumatic event just get basically neutralized. And then the sleep restoration was the most impactful, because now all of a sudden your body's able to process. And one of the therapists there, she's actually an Air Force veteran, and she works out of First Orlando Counseling Center. So I'm like, Cynthia, I need to schedule some appointments with you. I'm blocking 2 weeks off, because I'm like, we're doing 2 weeks worth of this stuff. I'm getting rid of everything. And then literally after the third appointment with her, I was like, hey, Cindy, I'm going to have to cancel the rest of my appointments because I really don't have anything left. Right.
Yeah.
Which is profound. Like, I mean, the fact that you can go through your entire trauma history in a very short period of time, one is mind boggling, and it doesn't make sense. I mean, this does not make sense on any level. But you feel that, and when I realized how real this was the following August. All right. August 19th is when we lost Doug. July, getting ready to come into August was difficult for me, because I knew that anniversary would come up, and you get all those triggers and all those emotions, and start drinking a little bit more, and worrying about that date. And the next thing I know, I'm looking at my phone and I see my Facebook feed, and I had missed the anniversary of his death, which for
Mm.
me was like, holy crap, right?
Mm.
He passed in 2011, and every year that month was horrendous. And all of a sudden, I just missed the anniversary of his death. And that's when you
Mm.
realize, wow, that disconnected the triggers. And I'm like, this is crazy. So that was kind of my paradigm change. The VA actually funded a study up at Walter Reed comparing exposure therapy, the VA's gold seal treatment, to the RTM protocol.
Mm.
Was supposed to publish in September of 2021. It was a 2-year clinical trial, and then they decided to punt it to 2023. So they're kicking it down the road. Why would they do that? That's my question. They've already got the data. They already know what they have, but yet they've decided to put another 2 years, and that's going to be 16,000 veteran suicides.
Mm.
Because if they had something that was non-re-traumatizing and non-stressful, imagine your whole trauma history. Within 4 or 5 sessions, you're done with therapy with that part. You can do
Yeah.
the cognitive therapy at that point. You get that 800-pound gorilla gone.
Right.
And veterans wouldn't be afraid to go to therapy at that point.
Yeah.
The exposure therapy, what's so difficult about that is, well, one, you can't, the quit rate is very, very high,
Yeah.
extremely high. The success rate, and you got to realize what the VA considers a success. In the clinical world, a 10-point decline in scores is considered a success for them. All right. You're not going to go from a 74 score on the PSSI 5, which is a 0 to 80. You're not going to, if you go from a 74 to a 64, they consider that successful. All right. That's a success for them. That's a high reduction, but the stuff that you're seeing with what we're doing or what the RTM does, that 74 is going down to zeros, ones, and twos.
Yeah.
That's not clinically significant. That's clinically gone, right?
Yeah.
That's asymptomatic at that
Yeah.
point. So it's wild. It's been a wild ride. I will say that. We originally started sponsoring therapists. We would pay to get them trained in the RTM protocol. And then when COVID hit, everything kind of changed because all the money dried up, and we're like, and then you realize, therapists are restricted by the states. So we're like, if wherever they are, that's the only people that are going to get help with it, because they wouldn't do cross state, telehealth. Telehealth was not even, approved for mental health until COVID hit. So we did is instead of like throwing in the towel, we just regrouped. The board of directors for 220 got together and said, hey, how do we fix this? How do we address this? So we're like, hey, you know what? We're a nonprofit. We've got a lot of latitude in what we can do as an organization. And then we just went down the rabbit hole of neuro-linguistic programming, NLP. That's where the stuff is rooted in.
Mm.
So the visual kinesthetic was originally developed for a fast phobia cure for like fear of heights, fear of frogs, snakes, lizards, whatever. And what we did is we did a lot of modifications of it to get it to where it is right now. Because if you look at the two side by side, they're not the same, but they're based on the same principles.
You're saying
And
the
so,
visual kinetic and the NLP are not the
yep,
same, but based on the same.
yeah, visual kinesthetic disassociation. So you got to imagine what you're doing is you're creating those start points and end points. What you did before the trauma, what you did after the trauma, and you create those black and white images. The VKD, you're in a movie theater setting from a projection booth, and then you're watching the screen and you're playing the movie forwards and backwards, but you're always watching the event. What we do is we're just going to stay watching ourselves versus the event. So we further disassociate them what the VKD does. And then do things like, well, who goes to the movie theaters anymore, right? Most people, it's a cell phone, right? So, hey, use your cell phone, use your iPad. Where are you the most comfortable? You might not be comfortable in a movie theater,
Yeah.
but you can be in your house. I worked with a Marine who didn't feel safe anywhere, right? So this was Johnny Walker, right? He was in our documentary, Healing the Heroes of 9/11. And he goes, well, I don't feel safe anywhere. I said, well, do you trust the Marines you worked with? Oh, hell yeah. Just like a typical grunt, right? And so I want you in your mind, I want you to watch your squad enter and clear your house. Right. And then they're going to come outside and they're going to hold perimeter around the house. Would that make you feel safe? And he does it in his mind. He goes, oh yeah, I could do this. And then we did it. And then we got that disconnect. Joe Nigro worked with him first, and then I worked with him on a second event. It was funny because He was like, dude, you're Yoda. I'm like, no, 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 no. He's like, you just got rid of 20 years of survivor guilt like that, you know? And it was just so funny to watch it. You know, I get a kick out of it because I know what they're going to experience, even though they're very skeptical going into it. But to see that profound change is it's just remarkable. You know, it's so. Anyways, you got those visual kinesthetics, you got the visual imagery before and after an event. You drain the color, you turn them black and white, and then you watch yourself, third person, watch the movie. You know, because once that trigger's active, there's literally a 4 to 6 hour window that you can. It's malleable, so you can change the state that's attached to the memory.
Oh,
So we're
oh,
not
okay.
changing the memory. The memory is never going to change. What we're changing is that emotion, because the problem isn't the visual; it's the feeling attached to the visual.
Yeah.
All right. So think of amygdala, neural pathway connected to a visual, and then another neural pathway connected to an emotion.
Mm.
That's kind of the makeup of PTS. That's why maybe you smell something that's in this visual, or you see something, and then boom, the emotion just goes crazy.
Mm.
And that's what you're feeling, and that's what makes gets you sick. You know, that vagus nerve starts getting active, the stress hormones go crazy, and then your adrenaline goes up, and then you're anxious. You know, that's the problem. It's those feelings. It's not what you see.
Right.
So when you get to that disassociated part and you get them regulated, watching themselves and the self watching the movie, then you enter the end of the movie and you just do a rapid rewind. You go from a black and white picture at the end to a color picture at the beginning in about 2 seconds, and that's when the neural pathways disconnect, because the brain at that point is like, it's almost like you're hacking the brain, right? So now the
Yeah.
brain sees the event ending at the good point in color. It's going
Mm.
from the newer memory in black and white to the older memory in color, and it's reversing the order. So
Mm.
the brain looks at it. I'm not supposed to do this. That's the amygdala saying, all right, timeout. And that's where that neural pathway disconnects. And once
Wow.
that pathway disconnects, the pathway between the emotions and the memory disconnect. Well, guess what? They got to go somewhere. And this is the reconsolidation piece. The memory goes into the cerebellum, your long term, and then the emotion goes into the hippocampal region, which is where the emotions are stored for future use.
Mm.
And once they split, that starts that whole reconsolidation piece. And typically between the first and third session is when the REM sleep will reset. And then all of a
Yeah.
sudden you feel like a whole different person, because now the brain has got a new tool. All right. You've given it a new skill. It can go now into REM sleep, and it can process out those emotions and move the memories into the hard drive and get it out of the thumb drive. That's kind of like the amygdala, easy access, emotions,
Yeah.
memories, feelings. So you change that, and then that's when the brain actually starts to reset itself, and then it starts to healing itself. The neuroplasticity hits. Think of somebody with TBI injuries on top of trauma. The brain is fighting. That the hurts of the brain are going so active, it can't work on healing the physical injuries. It's just working on the emotional piece. When you shut off that emotional piece, now the brain can go focus on the physical piece, and that neuroplasticity will then, the brain will then over time start working on healing itself.
Yeah.
So it's wild. I mean, it's neuroscience 101. I mean,
It's
you guys just got a lesson in it.
it's it's amazing, and it's so hard to describe, but I can tell you, my own experience being trained and serving others through TRP and EMP. Like I'm batting 1,000, man. Like and the folks I've had the pleasure and honor to serve in this capacity, from this impact that you guys have brought together. I've said this 1,000 times, but I want to say it on a podcast. I love that point at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And you were talking to me about one I just recently served, and we start the process like, hey, rate. You do the trigger, think about it. What's your rating, 0 to 10? And my man was like, 10, brother. It's been 10 for 20 years. It's 10.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even. It's a 10. And I said,
Yep.
okay. And we went through the process, and then the end, he goes, and this is my favorite part for every session. They give you that deer in the headlights look,
Yeah.
confused, and you ask them, hey, again, think of that negative event. Think of the event that's been troubling you. No negative emotion, 0. Severely intense, 10. Where are you now? And they just have this bewilderment in their face, and they go, and that's my man was like, that was a 10. He's like, 0, but I don't want to say 0. Like I feel like I should be saying 1, but I wouldn't be being honest. What and that's just this
Mhm.
relief that comes over them, and then they can talk about it. Some folks I work with after session, they start processing it. And they they could talk about it. Like, and I've had people tell me, man, I've never told anyone that. And look, the beauty of the 22-0 process, like you said, we don't have to talk about it. I tell them up front, like, you're welcome to talk to me about anything, but you don't have to. We're going to get you healed up either way. But afterwards, they feel like this. I'll say empowerment. Maybe they feel like they can talk about it. And
Right.
I've come at the end of those sessions at those points when they hit that zero, they're like, "Du-du-du-du-du-du," and they're just, and then go, I've never told anyone ever that, and I'm like, that's because you're processing it, man. Like, you can, like, and I learn every time I talk to you and hear from you, that's, they're detached from that emotion. So now they can logically, process it, I guess.
Yeah, I speak at a lot of events, and people will always come up. How can you talk about that? I was like, I can talk about it because I don't feel it anymore. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Before I was healed, the story owned me.
Yeah.
I was literally that story's little bitch. Right? When you fix that, you now own your own story.
Yeah.
I can share my story with anybody. There are times where I still might get some emotion because Doug was a good kid. There's still some sadness there,
Sure.
but that's just because there's a value to him, and that's a
Sure.
normal human emotion. But the visceral emotion that's connected is gone. That fear, that terror,
Maybe we put it
helplessness
another way, the one that physically controlled you, right? Like,
yes,
that attachment is
is
gone,
gone.
right? You can still feel the emotion per se, but it's the weighted severity of how it manifests itself, right? Like, that's what's been processed.
Yeah, we're emotional creatures, right? So when those emotions are active, we follow them. If it's a bad emotion, we'll follow that bad emotion. Maybe it's anger, right? And all of a sudden you're angry for a week
Yeah.
because you're constantly recycling that anger emotion. We just like with the good emotions, we love to follow the good emotions, but when your limbic system has been hijacking the brain for so long, we typically follow the bad emotions, which is why we isolate. All right, what does that do to the quality of life when we isolate?
Mm,
Or maybe we're fighters versus isolators, right?
yeah.
And all of a sudden you're fighting in bars every night because you feel good fighting. You
Hmm.
want to get some of that rage out. So we follow those emotions, and from 9/11, 2001 to current day, we probably had 130, 140,000 veterans incarcerated, making
Mm,
really poor decisions,
mm,
right? Based on the trauma, based on the experiences.
yeah.
And you hit on the other, we did the EMP process, the emotions management process. That one to me is almost equally as profound as the trauma work, because once the trauma is lifted, that's kind of the bear hug. Bear hugs all the emotions. It's got shame under it. It's got anger under it. It's got sadness under it. It's got fear under it. And then boom, you pull that trauma off, and then you have some raw emotions. Like, maybe you were molested as a kid. Now you got a lot of anger. That anger is manifesting itself, but you can actually release those emotions. And
Mm,
that part. And I'll share probably the most profound session that I ever did was with a World War II veteran. All right, he'd already done the work on the trauma, and Mel Jenner was his name. His last combat mission was a B-17 waist gunner flying over Normandy. So you can imagine the history that guy saw. His best friend was in a B-17 off to his flank that got shot down. Literally watched it spiraling down into the ocean. And he was like, "Do you ever think it's really ever gone?" I said, "What's that?" I said, "The PTSD." I said, "What are you feeling, Mel?" And he said, "Well, I felt guilty every day that I've stepped foot on U.S. soil since the war ended." This
mm,
guy's 98 years old at this time.
mm,
I'm like, whoa. I said, Mel, that's survivor guilt. That's an equal 800-pound gorilla to PTSD. So with him, what we do is you provoke the emotion. You get him to feel the emotion. He was a 10 because he was extremely emotional. Then we do the disassociate. We get him away from it. And then we have to change the framing because the brain's got to make sense out of everything that comes into it, right? So at that moment when his buddy died, it made sense to him that he should feel guilt for him living and his buddy dying. That's how his brain processed it. So he had that anchor to that emotion. And when you change the frame, it allows him to look at it differently. So I said, okay, Mel, you're now in Oscar's plane. You're going down. And Oscar's in your plane. And he's going to continue to live. And as you spin down in towards the ocean, every once in a while you'll get a glimpse. What do you want for Oscar? How do you want his life to play out? And he came up with all these ideas, and I want him to have a great family and a wonderful, whatever, wonderful world and wonderful life. And I says, do you want him to feel guilty for your death for the rest of his life? Oh, no, never. I would never want that. So, Mel, what makes you think he wants anything less out of you? And I'll never forget, he's sitting there and his eyes get really big and he goes, well, I've never thought of that. For 70 years, he carried that burden. And
Yeah.
in a freaking second, when that frame made sense to the brain, he released the emotion. He let it
Mm,
go. So he no longer has that visceral emotion connected because he applied a different perspective. You
mm,
know, most of those things we establish those emotions when we're very young and we don't understand how to process. So you can actually, whether it's anger, maybe because anger is one of those things where you can think about doing something tomorrow that would make you pissed off, and you all of a sudden you're pissed off, and you
yeah.
haven't even done it yet, right?
Yeah.
That's that future thought process. So when you see people release the emotion of the anger, and they get really confused because that was their go-to, especially for us guys, right? That's our big go-to. We're safe with anger. It's a normal, we're men, the bravado. There's nothing wrong with getting pissed off. And when they release that anger, now you have them think about that event that would piss them off in the future, and they're like, "Oh, can't find it." It's
Yeah.
because you've updated the operating system. You went back
Yeah.
to the root of that emotion, updated the operating system. So it's pretty cool, man. I can't. I feel so blessed to be on this journey. Um, the impact that we're having, not only with the veterans and the first responders, but the families. Think about it when how their kids react to them differently.
Yeah.
Because that generational issue with trauma, the way a parent acts towards a child will impact that child's life, right? So if you're a spouse or your dad's got PTS or your mom's got PTS and you're always walking on eggshells because you don't know how they're going to react, how does that impact that child?
Right.
So yeah, it's so cool to be able to see the whole family unit kind of heal through processes like that.
Yeah,
It's
because that
it's
in
it's
itself
remarkable.
for a child, right? We talked about different perspectives of trauma, and trauma, one of the things being the helplessness, right? The terror and helplessness. And if you think as a child who has a PTS driven parent who is possibly traumatizing them, and that child is helpless to the, you know, what's going on. That was just something else that gave me some new insights and appreciation for in the Body Keep Score was just the chain, right? The chain of the history of trauma being passed on and why, because not curing it, again, trauma to that 7-year-old who the dad is traumatized as well and flipping out, and but that child is still a child in a helpless environment, possibly fearing terror for himself or those, right? So it's, and there, boom, there it is. It just got paid. Trauma just got paid forward, so to speak. Unfortunately, the you mentioned before. So did I hear this right? Before you went to New Mexico, you had already started the nonprofit,
Right.
and that had you pivot to kind of what you're doing now. What were you going to do? Like, what was the game plan?
Initially, before I even started the nonprofit, I had an opportunity to build out a gun range for a big corporation, and I was going to run the gun range and that whole thing. That's what got me out of the sheriff's office, and then that door closed pretty quickly. And then I was like, okay, now what? And my ex-wife had a gentleman speak at the sheriff's office to a leadership conference. So like all sergeants and above had to go through this training, and he invited me to a men's leadership retreat, and that was April of 2018, and that's when I had that. Scott was like, Dan, you look like you have something. There's like 50, 60 guys in this training, and I'm just sitting there. I got this look on my face. He was, man, you look like you got something you want to say, and that's when I just said 22-0. I said, well, what's that? I said, there's 22 veterans every day taking their own lives. We're going to take it to zero. How we were going to fix that, I had no idea. But I was like, that's when the 22-0 was actually spoken. And then next thing you know, we're putting $15,000 of our own money into the nonprofit to get it started. I didn't know what we were going to do. I didn't know how we were going to do it. I was an NCO. I was an infantry guy, right? Ready, fire, aim.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
adjust fire after we start shooting. And that's when I just went down that journey and that rabbit hole. So,
And then not too much longer after the
yep.
asking
Not too
you will
much longer
receive,
now.
there it was. Yeah. The
Started exploring things, and next thing I think right now we're probably a little bit over 4,500 people, and that's probably a very low conservative number that we've actually impacted because we've lost contact with all of the therapists that we actually paid for their training. So
mm.
that's just what I know. What we're doing now with peer coaches and what yeah, it's mind blowing.
So what would be the message? A couple things for you about trauma that I just want to like make sure it's clear and out there from your perspective, because I think there's a few things that I wanted to touch on and get you to kind of speak about, which is, the importance of the courage to speak up. But even before that, like, what are some symptoms of trauma, right? Like, what are some tell signs that you may be suffering from PTS, regardless of the source, right? Because back to the
Right.
different perspective of people. And so, what would be the message you would share with people about kind of the
Sure.
stigma, this lack of awareness of what it is, and so on?
So some of the symptoms to look out for, one is sleep quality. Are you getting to sleep? Are you staying to sleep? Are you waking up 5 times during the night? Are you waking up in a pool of sweat? Are you doing cardio when you wake up in the middle of the night? Because that's indicative of your replaying a trauma inside the brain. Um, Sometimes there's parts of those traumatic events that you can't remember, like pieces are gone. That's an indicator that the brain is trying to protect you.
Mm,
Emotions flooding you whenever you're least expecting it is another one. The inability to focus is big. Just hypervigilance. Do you put your back to the wall and are you always looking at the exits? Are you always watching people's hands? Do you stop before you walk through a corner? A lot of those things are signals that there's something going on. Now,
mm,
the stigma that's attached to trauma, and this is a great conversation. There's a Dr. Frank Ochberg that I've had several conversations with. He was one of the original editors of the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual in 1980 when PTSD was added to that manual.
mm.
And he realized pretty quickly that labeling it PTSD did a major disservice to people because that's when the stigma was attached. Disorder,
Mm,
right?
mm,
Back when they said my diagnosis was post-traumatic stress disorder with major depressive disorder. Well, the only thing I heard in that conversation was disorder. I'm
yeah,
broken. There's something
yeah.
wrong with me.
And
I'm
with
weak.
some sort of permanence, right? Like,
Right,
yeah.
right. Yeah, and that's the other thing too, man. Because when I had my paradigm changed, I go back to my VA psychiatrist and I tell him I want to be reevaluated. Right. And I remember the conversation. He's like, why? What's wrong? He first defaulted, what's wrong? I said, well, nothing's wrong. I don't have PTSD anymore. I want my rating from 50% to drop to zero. Give the money to somebody who needs it.
Mm,
And he's a psychiatrist, mind you. And he goes, well, that's impossible. You can't cure PTSD. You're going to have it for the rest of your life, and you're going to need to manage it with therapy and medication. He's a doctor. He's the professional, right? So people tend to put stock in what these people tell you. And his paradigm is so closed off, he didn't believe in the possibility. And like the next couple conversations, had to go back every 4 months or 3 months, whatever. And next time I went, I gave him the research on the RTM protocol. Right?
hmm,
And then we had a conversation again after that. Did you read the research? And he's like, but it's still, he wouldn't reevaluate me.
mm,
He wouldn't do it. And then later found out that they won't touch those. They call them forever diagnosis. The only
wow.
time they'll drop a rating for PTSD is if they can prove that there's fraud, because they just don't believe that you can heal it. Because they've never seen it. They've never peered outside of that world of peer reviewed science.
Yeah.
Because all peer reviewed literature means is 30 doctors read the same article and all agree on it.
Yeah.
Well, there's no room for innovation at that point.
Yeah.
And this stuff isn't new. I mean, we stand on the shoulders of giants. I mean, Milton Erickson, Fritz Perls, Virginia Satir, those are some of the big names of psychology from the 50s and 60s. That's where this stuff comes from.
Yeah.
But it died with them.
Yeah.
And all we're trying to do is bring it back to life because I saw a need for me. And then when I felt it, I'm like, we got to get this to everybody. And that's kind of what's morphed us into a peer support. It was the clinical world, the naysayers, the people that said we can't do it. I had a conversation with a VA clinical psychologist in Orlando. Of course, she was beating me upside my head with her PhD and telling me that this couldn't possibly exist. It's snake oil. And I'm like, I'll pay for your training. I'll pay for your transportation. I'll pay for your lodging and your meals if you'll just go get trained in Tallahassee when we do this training in December of 2019. And she goes, I in good conscience could never do such a thing. You know, I'm like, oh, all right. I said, I'm just going to train my brother and sister to the left and right of me, and we'll just make your profession a lot less relevant. She didn't like that, but that's the drill sergeant coming out. When she said we couldn't do it, I'm like, all right, hold my beer. All right,
Yeah.
we'll show you
Yeah.
this. And the cool part is the genie's out of the bottle, right? It
Yeah.
ain't going back. There's no changing what's happening now. Because now we've got like Dr. Bequee, he's a psychologist, he's a licensed professional counselor, and he's starting the process to get that, what they call evidence-based. Evidence-based, prolonged exposure is evidence-based with a 15% success rate, right?
Yeah.
To
Right.
drop
Yeah.
them,
Yeah. Right.
it's like that's evidence-based. But what we're doing, Nick Davis, he would jokingly call it, well, we're not evidence-based, we're success-based, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of like a,
And I'm going to need to use that. I mean, because some of the things that locally, just seeing the impact and the success of it is, I've been getting the word out, word of mouth here locally, so that I can go talk to the Legion, the VFW, the Sheriff's Department, the EMS, with like, hey, here's some local trusted
Hmm.
that, it's not just me telling you this. I want you to hear from folks that I've served that have been impacted from it. And I was going to tell you, one of the that I hope you appreciate, and hopefully you're hearing this in other places, but one of the folks I recently served, that through 220, his source was his primary care doctor.
Yeah.
And I was like, I said, I saw on your sheet your primary care referred you to 220. And he goes, yeah, he read about you guys in some article or online or something. I was like, that's flipping awesome. Like, I was
Yeah.
just, it was awesome.
It's so cool because we've had licensed mental health counselors send people to us, right? Because
Yeah.
they couldn't fix them. The hope. I mean, I would love to have every therapist trained to do what we do because it would just make a better world. You look at the therapists and they're technically a force multiplier because everyone's funneling for help to those folks.
Yeah.
We have to go out and find people that need help, whereas
Yeah.
they're coming to the therapist. So the goal would be to have them to get trained because the whole society as a whole could actually help. Think about, the youngest to go through the TRP is 4 years old,
Mm,
right? What does that kid's life look like 20 years trauma free
sure.
versus with trauma, right?
Yeah.
I recently worked with a friend of mine, his 10-year-old son, just the other day, and he couldn't believe it. Like he drove from Orlando to Winter Haven to the house. He said he couldn't believe the conversations he was having on the way home. He said, it was my old son. He kept talking. He wouldn't stop talking, right? I
Yeah.
worked with a 7-year-old girl who was run over by an 85-year-old driver in a Starbucks parking lot, and all she talked about was death for 10 months with her dad. And so he was a firefighter that I'd worked with, and when he had his aha moment, he goes, "Please tell me this works with children."
Yeah.
I'm like, "Oh, kids are really easier than adults. They actually listen to what you tell them to do, and
Yeah.
they do it." And I did 20 minutes worth of work with her, and now she's back to normal, not talking about death anymore. So the impact isn't just us vets and first responders. The impact is civilians at large, domestic violence survivors, human trafficking survivors. Victims who've lost folks to homicides. It's endless.
Yeah.
Look at your prison populations, right? Because that's really cool. We're getting some good connections. We may be training some inmates out in California prisons that are like lifers,
Yeah.
and then they can work internally. So imagine what that does to that population. 97% of females that are incarcerated in prison were sexually assaulted before they ever entered the system, and
Mm,
78% of the men were.
mm,
So it's all trauma based, and
yeah.
it's the missing link. It's the trauma that leads to the behavior that leads to incarceration.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's pretty cool. We've trained a therapist out in Australia. She works with vets and first responders out there. We trained a cop up in Canada. We trained a doctor in Ethiopia, so he was
Yeah.
working with the survivors of the Ethiopian genocide. I'm pretty sure we're going to be in the Ukraine at some point. We trained a pastor out in California. He translated it to Spanish. He'll be taking it to El Salvador this summer.
Mm,
So I mean, the reach is endless. And when you look at the condition of the world right now, we need people to start letting some anger go and start letting some trauma go,
yeah.
so that we can get back to being good, decent human beings.
100%. And we need more soldiers in the good fight, right? Like that, like there's a good fight to be had here.
Yeah.
And we need more soldiers in the good fight, and we need this awareness. We need to shine a light on what is trauma, the effects of the trauma, and the fact that we can cure it. It's not a disorder. It's not permanent. It is something. And so, to bring it home, Dan, one, again, I have much love and respect for what you're doing. I quickly fell in love with this just because of the success that I've seen firsthand. I
Hmm.
personally felt, seeing that those I get to serve. So I'll be forever grateful for, I say that, I guess, this gift of service in a way, to like the awareness, and to be able to help you. Cause I'm with you with the part, like, we the world can be saved. It's just another tool to do it, man. And so that said, like, give us a little bit about what you're looking for 220 right now, how people get in touch, so on.
Yeah, so our biggest growth is going to be with active first responders. So like police departments, fire departments, training. If you run a peer support program, reach out to us. We'd love to work with you guys to train you so that you can intervene when the stress is just happened versus becomes and develops a problem. If you're interested in becoming a 220 coach, you can send an email to dan@220.org. We'll do assessments and evaluate, make sure you're the right fit. And if you're needing services, get help at 220.org. Just give us an opportunity to show you what life can possibly look like. You won't regret it. And if you're skeptical, we need skeptics. That's the only way. That was Dr. Bequee, right? Me, I was a skeptic. We tend to be the biggest drivers of moving forward because, like Dr. Bequee said, if this does what you say it does, I'm going to be joined at your hip.
Mm-hmm.
And when we trained him, he came down to the Sumter County Sheriff's Office training, and after the second day, and he watched me run a sergeant through the protocol and another corporal. He looked right at me. He goes, "Can I talk to the group?" I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "I came here to prove you were full of shit." That was his initial reaction, and I'm like, "Good, good. That's what we need." Don't just take my word for it. Experience it yourself. So if you're that skeptic, all it is a little bit of time. All right. There's no money for vets or first responders. You just get a little bit of time. The only thing you lose, maybe an hour, 2 hours of your time and a label. That's it. And get your sleep back. Get your life
Yeah.
back.
Yeah. I was going to say, but you get the gift of your life back,
Hey, and here's the other cool part. We're not mental health counselors, right? So I can't say you have it or don't have it. All I want to do is help you sleep better and not put a gun in your mouth. So whatever you tell the VA, who cares, right?
Sure.
We're not reporting anything to them. They wouldn't believe us even if we did. So you don't have to worry about losing benefits. That's what I'm saying. They wouldn't take mine.
Yeah.
And I told them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Dan, man, again, I appreciate you, brother. I honor what you're doing. Happy to help. And thanks for coming on and telling your story and pushing this thing forward.
Dale, thanks for the opportunity, man. Appreciate it.
All right. Yep. We'll talk soon, brother.
All right.